Chicago, 1958. A city of over 3 million people, booming, ambitious, and proud, where nearly 2 million residents were Catholic and where life was not organized simply by neighborhood, but by parish. Every square mile of the city had one. The parish was where you were baptized, where your parents were married, where your grandparents were buried, and where your children went to school. It was not just a church. It was an identity. And on the west side of Chicago, in the working-class neighborhood of Humboldt Park, one of the most vibrant of those parishes was Our Lady of the Angels, sitting at the corner of Iowa Street and Avers Avenue, serving over 4,500 families, most of them Italian and Eastern European immigrants who had come to America with very little and built something real. The school attached to the parish held over 1,600 children, from kindergarten through 8th grade, and on the morning of Monday, December 1st, they filed in, as they always did, coats hung on hooks in the hallway, books opened on wooden desks, clocks watched with the quiet impatience only children understand. It was the first day back after Thanksgiving. 3 o'clock dismissal was less than half an hour away. Nobody knew it yet, but for 95 of those children and teachers, 3 o'clock would never come. To understand what happened that afternoon, you have to understand what the building actually was, because from the outside, it looked like safety. The exterior was solid brick, the kind that made parents feel certain their children were protected. But the moment you stepped through the doors, everything changed. The interior of Our Lady of the Angels was constructed almost entirely of wood. The stairs were wood. The floors were wood, coated and recoated over decades with petroleum-based wax until they held the flammability of a torch. The walls were wood. The ceilings were 12-foot acoustical tiles laid over a wooden roof. One survivor, a firefighter himself in later life, put it plainly, they may as well have built it out of tinder and kindling. The school had been built in stages beginning in 1903, with a major north wing added in 1910 and an annex connecting it to a south wing built in 1939. The result was a U-shaped structure surrounding a narrow interior courtyard, enclosed on one side by a 7-foot iron picket fence with a gate that was kept locked. That detail, a locked gate in a courtyard, would cost lives. The building had no automatic fire alarm, no sprinkler system, no smoke detectors, and no heat detectors. There was one fire escape on the entire building, and the door leading to it was kept locked, with the key stored at the convent. The 4 fire extinguishers in the north wing were mounted 7 feet off the floor, unreachable for most children and difficult for many adults. The 2 fire alarm switches in the entire building were both located in the south wing, on the opposite side from where the catastrophe would unfold. The school had no alarm box on the sidewalk outside, and critically, the building's only alarm bell was not wired to the fire department. If the bell rang, the city would not know. Here is what makes this particularly difficult to accept. The school had passed a fire department safety inspection just weeks before the disaster. A fire department inspector had even noted during that visit the absence of fire doors on the second-floor stairwell landing. He wrote it down. But because the building was governed by the Municipal Fire Code of 1905, not the updated 1949 code, he had no legal authority to demand their installation. A grandfather clause protected older buildings from having to comply with modern safety requirements that were mandatory for any school built after 1949. The city of Chicago, the Archdiocese, and the state of Illinois all knew the building's limitations. They knew, and the children went to school there anyway. There was one more architectural detail that almost nobody discusses, and it matters enormously. Running from a basement all the way up through the building was a pipe chase, a narrow vertical shaft used to route plumbing. It connected the basement directly to the cockloft, the hidden attic space sitting between the second-floor classroom ceilings and the roof. That pipe chase was essentially a secret highway for fire. It meant that any blaze starting in the basement had a direct, hidden route not just up the stairs, but straight into the attic above every classroom on the second floor. The building was not simply dangerous. It was, by the science of fire, nearly perfectly designed to trap and kill anyone on its second floor the moment something serious began below. And there was the question of the children themselves, packed into those rooms in numbers that would be illegal under any modern standard. The baby boom of the late 1940s and early 1950s had flooded parishes across America with more children than the buildings could properly hold. At Our Lady of the Angels, classrooms built to hold 30 students regularly held 50 or 60. Coats were hung on hooks in the hallways rather than stored in metal lockers. And nobody questioned it because everyone accepted the overcrowding as simply a fact of the era. More bodies in a room meant more heat, less air, and in an emergency, more chaos at every window and every door. The school's physical dangers and its overcrowding were not separate problems. They were a single, compounding trap. In the city of Chicago, the archdiocese, and the families of Humboldt Park all sent their children into it every morning without knowing that every detail of the building's design was working quietly against them. Sometime between 2 and 2:20 that afternoon, in the cardboard trash barrel sitting at the foot of the northeast stairwell in the basement of the north wing, a fire began. Nobody saw it start. It burned alone in the dark for an estimated 20 to 30 minutes, slowly feeding on the papers and garbage inside the barrel, filling the enclosed stairwell with thickening smoke and steadily rising heat. Upstairs in room 212, a 10-year-old named John Melee was writing in his geography notebook, working through a question about where oysters could be found along the Atlantic coast. In room 208, 12-year-old Andrea Gagliardo was studying a history lesson about missionaries in Florida and Louisiana. In room 209, 13-year-old Michelle McBride was watching the clock with the rest of her 8th grade class, counting the minutes to dismissal. None of them could smell anything yet. The fire was patient. What broke the silence was physics. The intense heat building in the sealed stairwell eventually shattered a basement window. That broken glass let in a rush of cold December air, and the smoldering fire exploded into open flame. The wooden staircase caught. Within seconds, the stairwell was behaving exactly like a chimney, pulling superheated gases, black smoke, and fire upward with tremendous force. On the first floor landing, a heavy wooden door held. It was the only door. The fire screamed against it, could not pass, and turned upward instead. On the second floor landing, there was no door at all. Nothing blocked the hallway. The smoke, the heat, and the toxic gases poured freely onto the second floor of the north wing. At the same moment, the pipe chase did exactly what its design allowed. Superheated gases traveled up the hidden shaft and into the cockloft above the second floor classrooms, where the temperature in the hidden attic space rapidly reached ignition point. The building was now burning from above and below simultaneously, and not a single child or teacher on the second floor knew it yet. The first person to see the fire was the school janitor, James Raymond. Walking past the north wing's exterior, he caught the red glow of flames through a basement window. He ran into the furnace room, saw the fire raging through the stairwell door, and immediately sent 2 boys who were emptying trash nearby out of the building. He then sprinted to the rectory next door and told the housekeeper to call the fire department. She did, but she gave the operator the rectory's address, not the school's. The first fire units were dispatched to the wrong location. It is one of the cruelest small details in the entire story. The woman who made the call that should have saved them gave the wrong address. And by the time the error was caught and the correct location relayed, the building had used that margin of time to seal the fate of the second floor entirely. On the first floor, several teachers had begun smelling smoke and quietly led their students out of the building. None of them sounded the general alarm. They did not want to cause panic, and they could not locate the school principal, who was in the other wing covering a class for an absent teacher. Their caution, understandable in isolation, meant the hundreds of children on the second floor remained seated at their desks while the ceiling above their heads was already on fire. A woman named Barbara Glowacki, who owned a candy store in the alley along the north wing's exterior, was the one who finally triggered the box alarm. A passing motorist named Elmer Barkhouse had rushed into her store to ask for a phone, and she used her private line in her back apartment to call the fire department. That second call was what reached the main fire alarm office in City Hall. Engine Company 85, stationed less than half a mile south on Iowa Street, was the first unit to respond, arriving in under 2 minutes. What the crew saw as they turned the corner made everything instantly clear. Children were already falling from second-floor windows. Black smoke was billowing from the north wing. Parents who had arrived to collect their children were screaming on the sidewalk below. The second floor of the north wing was already lost. What made this fire so devastating was not just how fast it moved, but how specifically it moved. Every room on the second floor of the north wing tells a different story, and each one reveals something about what human beings do when the unthinkable arrives. In room 207, Sister Geraldine Innes taught her class on the far end of the north wing, closest to the building's only fire escape. When smoke began seeping under her door, she acted without hesitation. Janitor James Raymond, bleeding badly from a deep gash on his arm from forcing his way through to reach her, worked alongside Father Charles Hunt to pry open the locked fire escape door. Every student in room 207 survived. All of them. Raymond later received death threats at his home in the middle of the night, with grieving parents choosing the man who had spent that afternoon rescuing children as the target of their need to blame someone. In room 208, Sister Mary St. Canisling had 47 seventh graders seated at their desks when the smell reached her classroom. She walked to the door and opened it to look into the hallway. The corridor was already a wall of black smoke. She shut the door immediately and turned to face her students. She told them to stay calm, to get down on the floor, and to pray. She moved through the room, keeping her children together, keeping them breathing, keeping them as close to the window air as possible. When rescuers finally broke through, they found her body draped across a pile of her students. She had died trying to shield them with herself. 12 of her students died alongside her. Room 209 produced one of the most remarkable survivals of the entire disaster. Sister Mary Davidus Devine, an 8th grade teacher who lived to the age of 100, made a decision in those first moments that saved most of her students. She instructed them to stack their textbooks tightly along the edges of the door to slow the entry of smoke. She then looked out the window and spotted an awning on the building's exterior just below. A parent named Sam Tortoris, who lived across the street and had come running at the sound of the alarm, climbed onto that awning with a small ladder and began passing children through the window one by one. Father Joseph Ogbibena joined him. They saved most of the class together. Sister Devine was helped out last, after being told all her students were accounted for. They were not. Beverly Berta was still inside, unseen in the smoke. By the time anyone realized, the roof had collapsed over her. Only 2 students from room 209 died, but Beverly Berta was one of them, and Sister Devine carried that knowledge for the remaining decades of her life. There is a detail about that afternoon that almost never appears in news reports, and it deserves to be said plainly. 45 minutes before the fire broke out, 13 students from the most crowded classrooms of the North Wing had volunteered to help with a parish clothing drive being organized in the basement of the church building next door. They were folding and sorting donated clothes when the siren started. They walked out of that church and into a scene of unimaginable horror, but they were alive because they had chosen, on a whim, to do something generous before going home. 13 lives turned on a moment of kindness nobody planned. In room 210, Sister Mary Seraphica Kelly had her 4th grade class, some of the youngest children, on the 2nd floor. The smoke reached them fast and without mercy. 30 students died in that room. When firefighters finally broke through, they found surviving children still clinging to their teacher's body. Sister Kelly had died at her post. Room 211 suffered 25 deaths. A nun in that room held the classroom door closed with her body for as long as she physically could, trying to buy her students seconds against the smoke pressing through every gap. It was not enough. Room 212 was the furthest classroom from the stairwell, and what happened there is one of the most haunting details in the entire story. A student named Carlos Lozano raised his hand and told his teacher, Sister Mary Claire Therese Champagne, that smoke was coming under the door. She walked calmly to the door, opened it, and a solid wall of black smoke rushed into the room. She pushed the door shut. She gathered her students, led them in a short prayer, and moved everyone toward the windows. The drop from those windows was 25 feet, the equivalent of a 3rd floor because the school's English basement sat partially above ground level. Some children jumped. Some fell. Some were pushed by others in the crush of bodies behind them. Carlos Lozano broke his pelvis when he hit the courtyard below and survived. 26 of his classmates did not. None of them burned. Every child who died in room 212 was killed by smoke inhalation alone. When firefighters entered the room, they found children slumped at their desks with their hands folded, exactly as they had been sitting when they prayed. Sister Champagne died among them. Outside, firefighters were facing obstacles that consumed seconds nobody could afford. The iron picket fence enclosing the south-facing courtyard was locked, and the only way through was to hammer it apart with sledgehammers and a ladder, which took nearly 2 minutes. Those 2 minutes, measured against the speed at which the fire was consuming the building, meant entire rooms went unreached in time. More than 200 firefighters from 22 engine companies, 7 ladder companies, and 10 squad companies eventually converged on the school. They rescued more than 160 children from the burning building. But many of the children they carried out were already gone. Some bodies, recovered from the worst rooms, were so badly burned that they broke apart when firefighters tried to lift them. One journalist who arrived on the scene that afternoon was a reporter named Hal Bruno, who happened to be riding with Rescue Squad 2 on his day off. He later entered the northeast stairwell with 2 arson detectives and described what they found with precise clarity. A V-shaped char pattern rose directly out of the trash barrel and ran up the wall and staircase. One of the detectives kept repeating the same words quietly, just a common wooden door. One door on one landing. That was all that had stood between the children on the first floor and the same fate as those above them. By nightfall, 87 children and 3 nuns were dead. Mayor Richard J. Daley, a father of 7, was seen crying in public for the first and only time in his political life. Flags across the city were lowered to half-staff. The Chicago American newspaper devoted its entire front page not to headlines, but to photographs of the dead children under 3 words: Chicago mourns. Life magazine made the fire its primary story. The image that ran on the opening page showed firefighter Richard Scheit carrying the body of 10-year-old John Jajkowski out of the building. John had played accordion, sung in the church choir, and told people he wanted to become a priest. That photograph was later reproduced as a fire prevention poster and distributed to schools across the nation. The funerals began and did not seem to stop. A mass funeral for 27 of the victims had to be held at the National Guard Armory because no church in Chicago was large enough. Over 7,000 people attended. The 3 nuns were buried first in a requiem mass at Our Lady of the Angels Church, with a color guard of 100 police officers and firefighters and more than 100 of their fellow sisters traveling from across Illinois and from their Order's mother house in Iowa. At that funeral mass, the presiding Monsignor praised what he called their gallant heroism, but he did not name them. He believed they would have wanted to be remembered simply as sisters who died with their students. It would be decades before historians and journalists pieced together the full stories of their lives. Their names were Sister Mary St. Canis Ling, Sister Mary Seraphica Kelly, and Sister Mary Claire Therese Champagne. What followed the funerals was a silence that many survivors have described as its own kind of damage. There was no psychological counseling, no structured support, no community processing of grief. The church's guidance was to not dwell, to not speak of it, to accept it as God's will and move forward. Survivor Iran Sarno, who had been 10 years old and trapped in room 210 alongside his younger sister Joanne, put it directly decades later. The priest said this was God's will, and he thought, what kind of God would will this? Children who had survived were left to process alone. One nun who had been teaching that day suffered a complete nervous breakdown and was quietly removed from her duties without a word of public acknowledgement. Many parents never recovered. Divorces multiplied across the parish. Families began leaving the neighborhood one by one, unable to look at the building, the street, the courtyard where children had fallen. Within a decade, the community that had been one of the most tightly woven in Chicago had quietly dissolved. One survivor described it simply and without sentimentality. The fire destroyed the neighborhood. It destroyed the people. Parents couldn't cope, and they were left to do it entirely alone because the institution that shaped their entire lives had decided that silence was the appropriate response to the worst thing that had ever happened to them. The investigators arrived and found no easy answers. The Cook County Coroner's inquest, involving engineers, architects, and insurance professionals, concluded with more than 20 non-binding recommendations and a determination that the cause of the fire was undetermined. The National Fire Protection Association published a blistering report accusing both the city and the Archdiocese of housing children in fire traps. No grand jury was ever convened. The Archdiocese paid roughly $3 million in wrongful death and injury lawsuits. No one was ever criminally charged. Blame scattered in every direction. The man who bore the most of it publicly was James Raymond, the janitor who had spent that afternoon rescuing children and breaking down locked doors while bleeding from a severe arm wound. His 12-year-old son, Thomas, watched his father receive threatening phone calls in the middle of the night from parents looking for somewhere to place their grief. Raymond never spoke about it publicly. Then, in early 1962, Police in the Chicago suburb of Cicero arrested a 13-year-old boy for setting a series of fires in apartment buildings. When investigators learned this boy had been a fifth-grade student at Our Lady of the Angels on December 1st, 1958, they pressed him further. His family retained an attorney, and it was agreed the boy would submit to a polygraph examination conducted by John Reed, Chicago's most respected lie detector expert. What Reed uncovered was deeply unsettling. The boy's pattern of fire setting stretched back to the age of 5, when he first set fire to a garage. He had set at least 11 fires across Chicago and Cicero, always by the same method: matches dropped onto papers at the base of a stairwell, then walking away calmly. When Reed brought the conversation to Our Lady of the Angels, the boy became evasive. Reed leaned close and told him quietly, "There are 92 children and 3 nuns sitting in heaven who want to hear the truth." The boy then described in specific detail how he had asked his teacher permission to use the bathroom, gone to the school basement instead, thrown 4 or 5 matches into the trash barrel at the foot of the northeast stairwell, waited until the fire was truly going, and walked back to his classroom. The details he gave about the fire's precise origin had never been released to the public. He should not have known them. When Reed asked why he had never confessed before, the boy said he was afraid of the electric chair. Judge Alfred Salela dismissed the confession in family court, ruling it had been improperly obtained. Because the boy was under 13 at the time of the fire, Illinois law also prevented him from being tried for a felony regardless. The judge found him delinquent for the Cicero fires and sent him to a home for troubled boys in Michigan. He was released in 1965, served in the military in Vietnam, became a truck driver, built a family, and settled on the West Coast. He died in 2004. The official cause of the Our Lady of the Angels fire remains undetermined. The last child to die from injuries sustained that afternoon did not die on December 1st. He died the following August, 8 months after the fire, still hospitalized from what the building had done to him. The toll climbed slowly and painfully through the winter. 3 more children gone before Christmas, another in the spring. The final number was 95. 92 children and 3 nuns. Every single one of them had been on the second floor of the North Wing. Not one person on the first floor or in the South Wing was seriously harmed. The stairwell door made that difference. One door. From that unbearable fact, something permanent changed in America. The National Fire Protection Association's president stated publicly that there were no new lessons to be learned from this fire, only old lessons that had tragically gone unheeded for too long. That statement, rather than closing the conversation, forced it open at a national level. Within a single year, more than 16,500 school buildings across the United States were brought up to modern fire safety standards. Within 2 years, 68% of all American communities had implemented new fire safety requirements for their schools. Fire investigators traveled from as far as London to study the building and its failures. The Los Angeles Fire Department conducted a controlled series of fire tests in school buildings specifically modeled on the construction of Our Lady of the Angels, and their findings directly shaped the rewriting of the National Safety Code. The National Fire Protection Association overhauled NFPA 101, its life safety code, from the ground up. The revised code required automatic sprinkler systems in schools, enclosed and fire-resistant stairwells, fire-rated walls between classrooms and corridors, direct alarm connections to fire departments, non-combustible waste containers with lids, smoke and heat detectors in specific locations, and maximum classroom occupancy limits calculated at 20 square feet per student. Wood interiors gave way to concrete. Open stairwells became enclosed fire towers. The grandfather clause that had shielded buildings like Our Lady of the Angels from modern requirements was finished as a defense in school construction nationwide. The NFPA states it plainly in its records. No school fire in the United States since December 1st, 1958, has killed more than 10 people. The neighborhood around Iowa Street and Avers Avenue grieved in slow motion across the following decades. The Archdiocese demolished the ruins of the North Wing and built a new steel school on the same ground, which opened in 1960. The Sisters of the Blessed Virgin Mary continued teaching at Our Lady of the Angels until 1999, when falling enrollment finally forced the school to close. The church building beside it fell into disrepair. Families that had defined the parish for generations had scattered across the suburbs, carrying grief that many of them never spoke of openly and never fully set down. A memorial that had been installed inside the school was quietly moved to Holy Family Church for safekeeping when the building closed. Then, in 2005, a Franciscan friar named Father Robert Lombardo arrived and began what many people in the neighborhood had long believed was impossible. He described the church as a handyman special when he first walked in. Over years of volunteer labor and donated materials, with restoration costs that should have reached nearly $2 million but came in far below that figure, because of what people gave freely, the building was brought back. On April 15, 2012, around 400 people gathered for the rededication of what is now called the Mission of Our Lady of the Angels. Many of them were survivors. Many were the adult children of people who had died that afternoon. The memorial listing all 95 names was reinstalled on the front lawn of the rectory, on the exact ground where the bodies had first been laid when they were carried out of the building. The mission today runs food pantries, youth programs, and community outreach, serving over 3,000 families every month in a neighborhood that still carries the weight of what happened there. One of the children who walked out of Our Lady of the Angels that December afternoon was an 8-year-old third grader named Jonathan Friga. He grew up to become Jonathan Kane, the keyboard player for the rock band Journey. On the 50th anniversary of the fire, he wrote and recorded a song called Before They Came Angels. He never forgot what he walked away from or who did not. Sister Geraldine Ennis, whose entire room 207 survived because she acted with precision and without panic, suffered a nervous collapse in the weeks following the fire. She eventually recovered and returned to teaching, spending another 30 years in classrooms in Iowa before her death in 1997. Sister Mary Davidis Devine, who had told her students to barricade the door with textbooks and identify the awning that gave them a path out, lived to the age of 100. She carried Beverly Berta's name with her until the end. Father Joseph Ognibena, the priest who had climbed onto that courtyard awning and pulled child after child through the window of room 209, was assigned to other parishes across the Chicago area in the years that followed. He never forgot Our Lady of the Angels. People who knew him in his later years said that it changed him for the rest of his life. He passed away at 77. The firefighters who carried children out of those rooms that afternoon, many of them veterans of World War II who had seen things most people never see, spoke in later years about the Our Lady of the Angels fire as something different, something that stayed. You could not describe what they had seen, one of them said. These were vibrant young people, and they were gone. There are 95 names carved into the granite memorial at Iowa Street and Avers Avenue. They belong to children who were watching clocks that afternoon, waiting to go home for dinner, to finish homework, to play in the street before the cold drove them inside. They belong to children who had Thanksgiving still fresh in their memory and Christmas still ahead of them. They belong to a 10-year-old who was writing about oysters in a notebook he would never finish. They belong to a boy who played accordion and wanted to be a priest. They belong to 3 women who chose every morning to stand between their students and the world, and on one particular afternoon paid for that choice with everything they had. The names of Sister Mary St. Canis Ling, Sister Mary Seraphica Kelly, and Sister Mary Claire Therese Champagne are carved there alongside every child they ever taught. Every school in America that has an enclosed stairwell, a sprinkler system, a fire door, a smoke detector, and an alarm wired directly to the fire department stands differently because of what happened in that building on that December afternoon. Every child who has ever practiced a fire drill and walked calmly out of school building and across a field, not knowing why it matters, not knowing the name of the fire that made it mandatory, not knowing that a 10-year-old once sat at a desk writing about oysters while the ceiling above him was already burning, carries something forward that cost 95 people everything. The least any of us can do is know their names. And remember that it was not an accident of fate that killed them. It was a series of decisions made by people in offices and meeting rooms that determined a building full of children did not need to be protected, knowing that is the only thing that gives those 95 deaths meaning beyond grief. It is the reason we remember.